Eddie Levert, the mighty heartbeat of the OJs, the voice that carried Love Train, Backstabbers, and For the Love of Money into eternity. For over 6 decades, his sound wasn't merely heard, it was felt, echoing through generations with the weight of faith, pride, and black resilience. From the small church pews of Alabama to the glowing lights of the world's grandest stages, he rose from dust to destiny, turning hardship into harmony and pain into power. Eddie Levert isn't just a legend. He's the pulse of survival itself, the sound of a man who turned brokenness into brilliance. Yet behind the triumphs, the storm never truly passed. The man who healed millions with his voice has buried 3 of his own children. Now, at 83, the titan who once lifted the world stands in silence, facing ghosts only his soul can name. When the applause fades and the music quiets, can the man who taught the world to love still find peace within himself? Before we begin, press like and leave a heart in the comments. A small act of love for the last great soul warrior still singing through the storm, because some voices must bleed before they can shine. Every soul born to greatness begins in struggle. Eddie's journey was carved from hunger, silence, and faith. Out of the red clay of Alabama came a boy whose pain became his power. He was born on June 16, 1942, in Bessemer, a place where steel dust coated the lungs and dreams died before they could bloom. His father worked brutal hours in the mills. His mother cleaned other people's homes until her hands cracked and bled. Their home was a frail wooden shell that moaned with the wind and leaked in the rain. Some nights the table was empty, and his mother would split the last slice of bread, giving him the larger piece. "Eat, baby," she'd whisper. "Mama ain't hungry." He knew she was lying. That moment etched something eternal inside him. A promise that he would one day sing loud enough to feed every mother who ever went hungry for her child. He grew up invisible, one of countless black children born into a country that had promised freedom but delivered pain. School was cruel. Classmates mocked his shoes. Teachers overlooked his worth. But inside the small Baptist church down the road, his mother whispered, "Sing it like you mean it, Eddie." And he did. That voice, trembling, rising, bursting with soul, filled the room like a beam of sunlight through storm clouds. Every note was a prayer, every verse a cry for survival. Years later he would say, "That church saved me from silence." When Eddie turned 6, his parents made a desperate choice. They packed up their lives into a rattling truck and drove north to Canton, Ohio, chasing the rumor of a better tomorrow. It was part of the Great Migration. Millions leaving the Jim Crow South, searching for dignity in the cold, industrial North. The journey was long and uncertain. They slept in their truck, shared scraps of food, prayed for mercy with every mile. Canton was not the paradise they imagined. Winters there were merciless. The barefoot boy from Alabama now trudged through ice in torn shoes that let the cold bite his feet. His father's back bent lower each year under factory labor. His mother's hands, once soft, became a map of sacrifice. But still, every Sunday, they sang. "The darker it gets," his father told him, "the brighter we must sound." And so the Levert house became a temple of song, a fragile sanctuary built from faith and fatigue. Eddie sang to stay warm. He sang to forget the hunger. He sang because silence hurt worse than poverty. When you got no heat, he'd later say, you learn to make fire from your own breath. That fire became his identity. By 15, singing wasn't a dream. It was his rebellion, his salvation. Music straightened him where hardship had tried to break him. Out of cold came rhythm. Out of hunger came soul. Out of struggle came purpose. He was the kind of man who could take pain, wrap it in melody, and send it soaring back to heaven. He had no wealth, no connections, only a voice. But sometimes one voice is enough to move the world. From a boy who sang for supper, Eddie Levert became a man whose voice earned over $20 million. Yet money was never the measure. The measure was survival. Faith, he learned, isn't what you shout on Sunday. It's what you sing when your stomach is empty. Greatness isn't built from comfort, it's forged in fire. And Eddie Levert's fire never went out. His was a voice born of storms. Thunder turned into music. Sorrow turned into grace. The hunger never left, but neither did the faith. Through every triumph and every tear, Eddie Levert taught the world that music can do what life cannot. It can turn pain into power and tragedy into truth. He wasn't supposed to rise, but he did. And through his voice, generations found the sound of strength. It didn't disappear, it simply changed form. What once gnawed at Eddie's stomach now lived behind his ribs, burning like a quiet fire that refused to dim. The boy who sang to drown out hunger had grown into a young man chasing the sound of freedom. The church walls that once held his voice could no longer contain it. He needed streets, smoke, neon lights, and strangers, anyone willing to believe in him even for one song. But dreams, like rent, always come due. Faith was beautiful, yes, but it did nothing to fill a gas tank. In the late 1950s, Canton, Ohio was a town of cold wind and colder futures. Steel mills screamed at sunrise, and hope was something people learned not to ask for. Eddie took any work he could find, sweeping floors, loading crates, scrubbing tools alongside men old enough to be his father. But every night, he ran to the music, rehearsing with his boys in garages that smelled of motor oil and concrete dust. They called themselves the Triumphs, then the Mascots. Under a flickering yellow bulb, they built harmonies from hunger and prayer. Their microphones were broom handles. Their amplifiers were their own lungs. Gas money meant more than dinner. If they had $5, they spent it on movement, not meals. In a rusted red Chevy that coughed smoke and desperation, they chased gigs across counties. They sang for crowds who barely noticed them, for pay that didn't cover food. When the night ended, they curled up inside that same car, jackets pulled tight, windows frozen over. Eddie woke to the sound of the wind knifing through the glass. His stomach burned, his fingers shook, but his voice burned hotter. We didn't have hotels, he later said, half laughing, half broken. We had headlights. They wrote songs on napkins and gas receipts, humming melodies into the cold air just to remember they were alive. They sang in silence. They sang in hunger. They sang in the dark, because stopping meant surrender. When they finally recorded a demo and mailed it to every label they could find, most envelopes came back unopened. The ones that did return came with wounds, too raw, too southern, too black. Eddie folded those words and placed them in his coat pocket, not as scars, but as fuel. If they won't open the door, he told Walter, then we'll build the stage ourselves. In 1961, a single crack of light appeared. King Records in Cincinnati offered a small deal. Barely a chance, but a chance was enough. They wore their best secondhand suits, drove through the night, and sang like the world depended on it. Maybe it did. They recorded Lonely Drifter, a song about wandering unseen through life. It was their truth disguised as melody. But when the record came out, radio stayed quiet. No one played it. We waited by the radio, Eddie said. It never came. The silence broke them. Bobby left. Then Bill. We'll come back when things get better, they said. But things didn't. Eddie watched their shadows fade into the night, the dream shrinking behind them. For the first time, the car felt too big and the world too small. But Eddie stayed, Walter stayed, William Powell stayed. They had no money, no connections, no guarantees, only each other and a voice that refused to surrender. By the mid-1960s, they renamed themselves the OJs, in honor of a Cleveland DJ who once believed in them. Belief didn't pay bills, but it kept them breathing. They sang in bars thick with cigarette smoke and loneliness. Some nights, 3 people showed, some nights, none. But Eddie sang like the heavens were listening. Every rejection became a lyric, he said. Every mile became a verse. Then came Philadelphia, the city of soul and second chances. One night, the lights dimmed. Eddie closed his eyes. He thought of his mother's cracked hands, his father's bent spine, the frost on Ohio windows. When he opened his mouth, he didn't sing. He poured pain, prayer, hunger, hope, all of it, all at once. The room didn't clap. It roared. It wasn't applause. It was recognition. The world was finally listening. The storm, he thought, had passed. But sometimes, the quiet is only the breath before fate strikes its hardest blow. By the early 1970s, Eddie Levert was 30 years old, standing at the edge of everything he had begged God for. In 1972, when the OJs signed with Philadelphia International Records, the world finally heard the sound his suffering had carved. Backstabbers hit like thunder. Love Train became a global shout of unity. For the Love of Money became prophecy. In 3 years, they sold over 10 million records. The boy who once sang for warmth was now the man whose voice warmed the entire world. He had risen. But destiny was not finished with him yet. From sleeping inside the backseat of a rusted car to commanding $100,000 a night on the biggest stages in the world, Eddie's climb was nothing short of impossible. The man who once sang just to keep hunger from swallowing him had now become a voice the world paid to hear. "We never dreamed of fame," he said quietly once. "We were just trying to survive." But as the spotlights grew brighter, something inside him began to dim. Between 1973 and 1980, the OJs lived on the road, 200 shows a year, city after city until the days blurred together like fever dreams. Tour buses became makeshift bedrooms. Hotel rooms became emergency rooms. Eddie's voice, once powerful enough to shake church rafters, began to crack under the weight of exhaustion. "If I stopped singing," he told a reporter, "I felt like I'd stop breathing." Some nights, his knees buckled backstage, dizzy, sweating, vision fading. But after a few minutes of silence, he would rise again and walk back into the lights as if pain was just another costume. People came to feel joy, he said later. They didn't come to see how tired we were. And while the applause grew louder, the money did not. Behind the gold records and sold-out arenas lived contracts designed to starve them. Unpaid royalties, unfair percentages, management deals built on greed. The group lost nearly $400 in just 2 years. Crowds of 20,000 roared their names, yet their pockets stayed empty. We were famous, Eddie said, but we didn't own our own voices. Then the blow that hurt deeper than money. In 1977, they lost William Powell, brother in music, brother in spirit. The harmony that once lifted them now echoed with an empty space no melody could fill. Eddie didn't speak much about the grief. He just sang harder, pushing his voice through pain as if trying to keep William alive in every note. But grief is heavy, and by 1978, exhausted and disillusioned, Eddie came close to walking away. I was tired, he admitted, tired of smiling when life hurt, tired of pretending the stage was home. But when he remembered those cold Ohio nights, those hungry prayers, those friends who never got to stand in the light, he could not leave. If we quit now, he told Walter Williams, then what did we suffer for? So we stayed, and the fire returned. By 1987, at 45 years old, Eddie roared back with Let Me Touch You, an album that climbed all the way to #1 on the R&B charts. The world clapped again, the world danced again, the world smiled, unaware that Eddie often sang through painkillers, exhaustion, and adrenaline. Between the late 1980s and early 2000s, the OJs earned over 10 gold albums and toured the world, building a fortune that would eventually surpass $20 million. We came from nothing, Eddie said. Everything we have, we carved from faith. But even when your hands finally hold the dream, the price of carrying it never goes away. People think success makes you free, he told an interviewer years later. Sometimes it only builds a bigger cage. The applause grew thunderous, but the silence after the lights went out grew heavier too. In 2005, when the OJs were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, Eddie stood beneath the same lights he once dreamed of as a hungry boy in Canton. The crowd rose to its feet. His name echoed through the auditorium like a hymn. Yet his eyes glistened with something more than pride. I thought of my mother's hands, he said afterward. I thought of every night I sang to survive. The spotlight felt warmer that night. But it also felt like a reminder. He had outrun poverty, he had outrun doubt, he had outrun silence, but no one outruns heartbreak. The stages faded into the quiet of home. The house that once shook with laughter now held a stillness that pressed against the walls. The woman waiting inside was the one who had seen every version of him, not the legend on stage, but the hungry boy, the tired man, the dreamer who prayed through every setback. Martha Bird Levert was not just his wife, she was the witness to every bruise and every breakthrough. They met in the early 1960s, when he was still singing for gas money in smoke-soaked clubs. She believed in him before the world did. They married in 1966, two souls holding each other through faith alone. Their first home was small, drafty, and often cold, but love made the rooms warm. Eddie practiced scales in the kitchen while she hummed gospel melodies over a pot of beans. When Gerald was born, Eddie cried, promising that his voice would build the life his son deserved. 2 years later, Sean arrived, full of spirit and fire. Those were the golden days. Eddie once said, we didn't have money, but we had music, and that was enough. But success has a price, and every blessing casts a shadow. It takes what it wants, and in return it demands everything you believed you could hold on to. By 1972, the OJs were no longer just performers. They were a force, a movement, a sound the world had begun to follow. The tours multiplied, the interviews stacked, the jet engines hummed louder than his own heartbeat. His schedule overflowed, but his home, the place where love once lived, began to sit in silence. The road gave me everything, Eddie would confess years later, but it also took me away from the things I loved most. While he stood under stage lights and thunderous applause, Martha stayed at home raising 2 boys who were growing faster than Eddie could return to see. The calls became brief, voices strained by distance, and the nights he came home were marked not by celebration, but by exhaustion. He would walk in at 3 in the morning, the smell of sweat, smoke, and music still clinging to him, and find Martha asleep on the couch, the lamp buzzing softly, the children's toys still scattered across the floor like reminders of time slipping away. Fame fed him while starving the family that once held him steady. There were no arguments in the end, only long pauses, long silences, a love that slowly dimmed under the weight of distance. Their last night together was not loud, it was quiet, just rain touching the window and 2 people realizing that the road had built a wall between them. When he left, he carried only a suitcase and his guitar. The laughter, the family, and the warmth stayed behind. Nearly 20 years of marriage folded into a few sheets of paper. The divorce didn't just end a marriage, Eddie later whispered, "It took my home away from me." The children stayed mostly with Martha while Eddie retreated into the only sanctuary he understood, the studio. He tried sending gifts, money, promises, but what his boys wanted was time, not applause. He spoke of Martha with a gentleness that never faded. "She loved me before I was known," he said. "She saw my wings before I could fly." And he said the same of Gerald, the boy who sang before he spoke. Eddie once lifted him high and told him, "You will sing louder than me one day." He could never have imagined how painfully true that would become. The day Eddie drove away from home, Gerald chased the car, holding a toy microphone, waving with all the hope a child can hold. Eddie watched the small silhouette shrink in the rearview mirror until it disappeared completely, a memory that would return to him in every quiet room for the rest of his life. "Every song I wrote afterward," he said, "was me trying to get back to that moment, to stay just 1 second longer." He believed losing his marriage was the hardest grief a man could know. He had no idea that deeper heartbreak was waiting. Years later, the silence born in his marriage would echo through his soul in a way no stage could drown out. Yet somewhere in Ohio, in a window glowing softly through the night, a single light stayed on, a reminder that not all love disappears, even when life forces you to walk away. At 63, when he believed love had already had its say, fate led him back toward it. By 2005, Eddie Levert had lived lifetimes. He had tasted the world's applause and its emptiest silences. He had buried dreams, friendships, and guilt. He had carried sorrow inside the same chest that once held fire. He was not searching for redemption when she arrived, only somewhere to rest. Then came Raquel Capleton, a quiet light in the long corridor of his story. She didn't come to repair him. She came to remind him that broken hearts can still love with strength. She was gentle, deeply spiritual, a woman who understood pain without speaking it. She was wise, A said, and she walked close to God. And for the first time in decades, Eddie laughed. Not the stage laugh, but the soft kind that lives in the kitchen while morning coffee brews. Their wedding was not extravagant. It was intimate, honest, two souls promising not perfection, but presence. Their daughter, Ryan, born in 2002 before they married, became the golden thread weaving this new beginning. Eddie, older now, held her with the care of a man who had learned what time can take. He braided her hair. He kissed her forehead before school. He sat at her bedside telling stories of her brothers, of music, of faith. The house filled again with laughter and gospel melodies. Yet the stage still called, the blessing and the curse. Some nights, Raquel sat awake, praying his heart would survive the weight of history and the price of fame. She did not marry the legend, Eddie reflected. She married the man who was still learning how to stay. When he withdrew into silence, she sat beside him without asking questions. When doubt tried to return, she reminded him softly, "Love is not just a song you perform once. It is a song you commit to every day. It's like trying to finish a song that has no last note," he said, "but you keep singing anyway, just to feel close again." Even now, so many years later, Eddie still speaks to his son before every performance. He keeps Gerald's photograph tucked in the lining of his guitar case, his laughter stored in memory, like a warm room he refuses to leave, his presence lingering in every breath drawn before the first note. "He's still here," Eddie whispers. "Every time I open my mouth to sing, I hear him harmonize from somewhere higher." And sometimes, when the stadium falls silent and the stage lights fade to black, Eddie swears he can hear that same booming laugh echoing behind the curtains. The same laugh that once filled his home, his car, his entire world. A laugh that said love did not disappear, it simply moved to another room. He had barely learned how to breathe again when the breath was ripped from him once more. 2 years after placing his firstborn into the quiet earth, Eddie found himself face to face with the same darkness, the same cold silence shaped like a grave. Grief, which had only just learned to walk slowly beside him, came running back at full speed. On March 30th, 2008, the same phone rang, the same ringtone that had haunted the corners of his dreams since Gerald's passing. His hand hovered above it. For a moment, he begged God to let it be a wrong number. But it wasn't. The voice on the other end trembled. "Eddie, it's Sean." A pause, a breath heavy with dread, then the words that shattered him all over again. "He's gone." This time, there was no scream, no collapse. There was no one left to catch him if he fell. He simply stared at the floor, feeling a familiar, bone-deep cold wash across him. The heartbreak had never healed. It had only learned how to sleep. Now it woke up twice as heavy. No father should have to bury his child, he whispered. But to God, Sean Levert, born September 28, 1968, was the quiet fire, the gentle heart, the bridge between storms. Where Gerald blazed bright with power, Sean glowed warm with patience. He had his father's eyes, his mother's grace, and a smile that softened rooms. Together with Gerald and childhood friend Mark Gordon, he helped create Levert, carrying the family's legacy forward. If Gerald's voice struck like thunder, Sean's voice healed like prayer. But after Gerald died, the light in Sean dimmed. Laughter came rarely. Songs grew heavier. He called his father often, sometimes saying nothing at all. "You still there, Pops?" "Yeah," Eddie would answer softly, even when his chest ached. "I'm right here. Keep singing, son." But silence had already settled around Sean's spirit, the kind that fame can't fix, the kind that applause can't reach. In early 2008, life delivered another blow. Sean was sentenced to 22 months in jail for unpaid child support. Not a crime of malice, but a misstep of circumstance. Eddie planned to visit him in the coming week, to talk about healing, rebuilding, hope. But the visit never came. In custody, Sean fell sick. Sarcoidosis, combined with high blood pressure and sudden withdrawal from medication, hit him hard. It was merciless, it was fast. He was only 39. Eddie did not cry. His tears had already carved their scars. He simply rose, walked to the framed picture of Gerald, and placed his hand upon it. "Make room for your brother," he whispered. Across town, Martha sat alone at her kitchen table, holding the same photograph she once tucked into Sean's grade school lunchbox. She didn't weep. She simply rocked slowly in her chair, whispering, "My boys, my babies." Until morning broke, Sean left behind a notebook of unfinished songs, lyrics scattered across sheets like broken wings. On one page he had written, "I'll see you again." He never recorded it. The melody stopped mid-line. The funeral arrived under a sky the color of sorrow. Rain tapped softly on stained glass, like a heartbeat too slow to save. The church was smaller this time. Fewer reporters, fewer cameras. But the grief was just as heavy, maybe heavier. Some faces were the same from 2 years before. Eyes worn, hearts still bruised. They had no words left. Eddie walked the aisle slowly, step by step, holding the same gold microphone he had placed on Gerald's coffin. In his other hand, the same handkerchief, still stained with grief no time could wash away. He laid them both atop Sean's casket, whispering, "How many songs can one heart carry?" The microphone tapped the wood. Soft, final. He did not sing, he did not speak. The choir hummed instead, rain keeping time outside. The song was "Baby Hold On To Me," but no one let it. It floated raw and unbroken, like a prayer too deep for words. When the service ended, people placed gentle hands on Eddie's shoulder. No parent should bury their child. No one deserves this kind of pain. But there are no words large enough to carry grief of this size. He remained long after everyone had gone. The candles burned low. The air held the scent of wax and rain. He sat in the first pew, staring at the two funeral programs folded together. Gerald and Sean, side by side. 2 sons, 2 songs, 2 silences. He reached out, touching the empty space beside him as if one of them might still be sitting there. "My boys," his voice broke. "You were supposed to bury me." Across town, Martha sat alone in the dim glow of her kitchen. The rain did not stop. She turned their baby pictures over and over in her hands. Gerald's dimples, Sean's smile. Her lips moved softly in prayer for a world that no longer held them. She no longer prayed for answers, only for rest. "God," she whispered, "just make sure they're not alone." And in the months that followed, investigations came, headlines came, legal statements came. But for Eddie and Martha, it all sounded like thunder from another world, distant and hollow. Later, the family received a financial settlement tied to Sean's passing, a large sum the newspapers labeled justice. But Eddie only shook his head. "No number," he said quietly, "can buy back the sound of your child's laughter." He gave most of it away. Scholarships, community programs, support for families who were drowning the same way theirs had. "If my son is gone," he said, "let his name help someone else breathe." But charity does not fill empty rooms, and grief does not disappear just because you share it. "They gave us money," Martha said once, her voice thin as paper, "but they can't give me my boy's voice back." Days dissolved into one long gray ache. Eddie wandered his own home like a shadow, speaking their names into quiet hallways, Gerald, Sean, but the house only answered with echoes, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the tired sigh of old wood floors. Every small sound felt like a memory trying to return. Some nights, he dreamed they were in the next room, laughing, teasing, arguing over harmonies. So real he could almost hear their footsteps. For a few seconds, he later admitted, "I'd believe it." And then morning came, and the silence was louder than any applause I've ever known. Yet even in silence, love has a way of reshaping itself. Months later, Eddie stepped on stage again. When he walked out, the crowd didn't roar. They stood in reverent quiet, holding their breath the way one does in the presence of grief. The lights fell slow and warm. He held the microphone to his chest and didn't begin right away. He just closed his eyes and said, "This one is for my boys." And then, gently, he began to sing "Baby Hold On to Me," but halfway through his voice broke, and the audience, thousands of strangers who had grown old with his music, finished the song for him, their voices cracked, trembling, filling the room with a love too heavy to speak. Some people wept openly, some held their hearts, some whispered silent prayers for children of their own. Eddie did not cry, he simply smiled, thin, trembling, aching. "I used to think grief was the end," he said later, "but it isn't. It's proof you still love." And so, before every show, Eddie still whispers their names, Gerald, Sean, not as ghosts, but as company, because he still feels them, just beyond the light, waiting to sing backup from somewhere higher. Sometimes, he says, when the lights go black and the crowd is silent, I swear I can hear them, both of them, laughing again. The world hears one voice when he sings, but every parent who has buried a child knows he has never been singing alone. Years passed, but time did not move the same for Eddie. The world kept changing, but his heart stayed in the rooms where his sons once laughed. Some nights he would sit with old photographs, Gerald grinning bold, Sean smiling softly, and in the middle, Martha, the woman who had stood beside him in hunger and hope, who had raised two boys on love and prayer, who had buried them and somehow kept breathing after. "She was stronger than me," Eddie said. "I lived near the pain. She lived inside it." By the late 2010s, Martha Bird Levert lived quietly in Cleveland, in the same house where she raised her sons. The gold records still hung on the walls, their shine dulled but their history alive. She kept their rooms almost exactly as they'd left them. Sean's unfinished lyrics still resting on his desk. Gerald's magazine covers still leaning against the dresser like someone had just stepped out for a moment. Neighbors would see her sitting by the window in the afternoons, radio playing faintly. Sometimes the OJs, sometimes Levert. Always the songs of her boys. "They were my music," she would say softly, "and I still hear them every night." But time had worn her down, gently, slowly, like a candle burning itself to the last inch of wick. Her body faded the way her heart had. Quietly, "I'm just tired," she would tell friends. "Don't worry, I've got two angels waiting for me." And in January 2020 they came. She passed away peacefully in her sleep. No pain, no fear, just silence, like the final note of a song that had played too long. There were no headlines, no wide news coverage, just a few who knew the depth of what the world had lost. When Eddie received the call, he didn't speak. He simply closed his eyes and let the quiet wrap around him. They had divorced long ago, but grief does not care about legal endings. It remembers love, devotion, history. "We walked through fire," he said, "and even when the flames died, she stayed with me in the smoke." At her funeral, small, gentle, holy, the choir sang the same hymn she used to hum while cooking dinner. Eddie stepped forward, placed a single white rose on her coffin, and whispered, "You're with them now." And he did not cry. There were no tears left to give, only love, only memory, and a song that will never end. She didn't pray for explanations anymore, only for peace. "God," she murmured into the stillness, "just make sure they're not alone." In the months afterward, headlines, legal statements, and cold official words came and went like distant thunder. None of it mattered. Later, a financial settlement was issued, a number large enough for newspapers to call it justice, but Eddie only lowered his eyes. "No amount of money," he said quietly, "can buy back a child's laughter." Most of it he gave away. Scholarships, community help, relief for families who were breaking under the same weight. "If he's gone," Eddie said, "then let his name help someone else breathe." But giving could not fill an empty room. "They handed us a check," Martha whispered once, "but they couldn't hand me my boy's voice." The days blurred into a long winter of silence. Eddie moved through his house like a man searching for something he had already lost, whispering their names into doorways and hallways. Gerald, Sean. The house answered with the soft hum of appliances and the tired sigh of aging floorboards. Each sound felt like a memory trying to return. Some nights he dreamed they were still there, laughing, singing, teasing each other, so real he could almost hear their footsteps. For a moment, he confessed, I believed it. Then the morning came. The silence that followed was louder than any applause he had ever received. But love changes shape instead of disappearing. Months later, he walked back onto a stage. When the audience saw him, they did not scream. They stood, not loud, but reverent, sharing his grief the way churches share prayer. The lights lowered. He held the microphone close and whispered, "This one is for my boys." He began to sing Baby Hold On to Me. And halfway through, his voice broke. The crowd finished it for him. Thousands of trembling voices carrying a song he could not carry alone. Some wept, some held their hearts, some whispered prayers for their own children. Eddie didn't cry. He simply smiled, a thin, shaking smile of someone who has lost everything but still knows how to love. I used to think grief was the end, he said later, but it's not, it's proof you're still alive. To this day, before every show, he whispers their names. Gerald, Sean, as if calling them to come sing one more time. And sometimes, when the lights go dark and the crowd goes still, he swears he hears them laughing in the rafters. The world hears one voice when he sings, but every parent who has lost a child knows he has never been singing alone. Years passed though time did not soften any of it. Some nights he found himself sitting with old photographs, Gerald bold and bright, Sean soft and smiling. And there, always, was Martha, the woman who had walked beside him through hunger and hope, who had raised those boys with prayer and faith, who had buried them, and somehow kept breathing afterward. She was stronger than me, Eddie would say. I lived near the pain. She lived inside it. By the late 2010s, she stayed mostly inside the quiet Cleveland house where she had raised her sons. Their rooms remained untouched. Sean's unfinished lyrics scattered across his desk, Gerald's framed covers leaning as if waiting to be hung. Neighbors saw her often at the window, a soft radio playing somewhere behind her. Sometimes the OJs, sometimes Levert. Always the songs of the boys she carried, loved and lost. They were my music, she would tell visitors, and I still hear them. But time can wear a heart thin. She began to slow, to soften, to fade like a candle's final flicker. I'm tired, she said gently, but don't worry, I've got two angels waiting. In January 2020, she slipped away quietly in her sleep. No fear, no pain, just stillness like the final note of a song that has finally said all it needed to say. No headlines, no spectacle, only those who truly knew her mourning the closing of a chapter the world never fully understood. When Eddie received the call, he didn't speak, he just closed his eyes. The divorce had long passed, but grief does not honor paperwork, it honors love. We walked through fire, he said softly, and even after the flames were gone, she stayed with me in the smoke. At her funeral, held in the same church where their sons had been baptized, the choir sang the same hymn she once hummed over dinner. Eddie stepped forward, laid a single white rose on her casket, and whispered, "You're with him now." He did not cry. His tears had been spent long ago. Only love remained, only memory, only a song that would never end. Because when a father has loved and lost this much, death doesn't silence the song. It just teaches him to sing in a new key. Grief had become the vocabulary of Eddie Levert's existence. Yet not every goodbye belonged to the family within his home. Some belonged to the men who once stood beside him under the burning spotlight, sharing the harmony that made the world rise to its feet. To understand Eddie's sorrow, you must remember the brothers who helped build the OJs long before fame kissed their names. They were just 5 boys from Canton, Ohio. Eddie Levert, Walter Williams, William Powell, Bobby Massey, and Bill Isles, chasing a dream no one could see but them. They traveled in sputtering cars, wearing second-hand suits, singing in smoky rooms where applause mattered more than pay. William Powell's voice was lightning, clear, steady, a beacon. Eddie always said William didn't just harmonize, he guided them. They shared hunger, laughter, and the stubborn belief that someday someone would listen, and the world did. But fame came with a devastating cost. By the mid-70s, the OJs were giants of soul, their voices echoing across continents. Crowds roared, records sold, lights blazed, and William Powell was quietly dying. The sickness came slowly, a fading of breath, a trembling of tone. Colon cancer, only 33. He didn't tell us at first, Eddie recalled. He just said, "Let's finish the album." William sang through pain that would have broken lesser men, sitting down when his knees gave out, waving the others to continue. He was afraid of the silence, Walter said. In 1977, William Powell passed at 35, and Eddie placed his hand upon the casket and whispered, "We began together, brother. You kept your promise." That night, the stage lights seemed dimmer. When Eddie tried to sing Love Train, his voice cracked, and the audience finished the chorus for him. Thousands of strangers holding up the song so he didn't collapse beneath its weight. But sorrow has a cruel echo. Another name began to fade, Frankie Little Jr., an early OJ songwriter and guitarist, passionate, unpredictable, fiercely loyal. One day in the early 80s, he simply vanished, no goodbye, no explanation. I always wondered, Eddie admitted. For nearly 40 years, Frankie was missing, his story swallowed by silence. Then in 2021, DNA confirmed the truth. The human remains found behind an abandoned Ohio factory belonged to him. He had been gone for almost 4 decades. Eddie sat with the news quietly. He was lost that long, he whispered. But now, at least, he's known. It wasn't closure. It was a wound finally given a name. Today, when Eddie steps onto the stage, the audience sees 3 men, but Eddie sees 5. He still glances to the left where William once stood, and to the back where Frankie tuned his guitar. "They're still singing," he said. Every time Love Train begins, I hear them from somewhere higher. The OJs were never just performers, they were brothers. And even when half the harmony is gone, the song continues, carried by love, memory, and the voice that refuses to let them disappear. Years passed, the music rolled on, and the stage kept thinning. Reunion photos held more ghosts than faces. We started as five, Eddie once murmured. Now sometimes I look around and I'm singing to shadows. Bill Isles, the quiet one, the peacekeeper, the one who held them together before the world cared, passed in 2019 at 78. Though he left the group early, he never left the brotherhood. When Eddie heard the news, he sat with an old photograph of the original 5 young men who believed in something no one else could see. "We were just kids," he whispered. "All we had was hope." But hope was enough to make history. He may have stepped away from the spotlight, Eddie often said, but he never stepped away from the dream we built together. In moments like that, time itself seemed heavier, as if the years were stones stacked on his chest. The dream endured, but the dreamers who shaped it had slowly disappeared. And then came 2022, bringing another goodbye he was never truly ready for. Bobby Massey, the co-founder, the fighter who stood beside Eddie and Walter when they were just boys with borrowed suits and borrowed hope, passed on. He had left the OJs in 1971 before the world knew their name. But the foundation of every song, every harmony, every step forward, still carried Bobby's fingerprints. He was the architect before the anthem. Eddie remembered him as a brother, not a bandmate. "We took different paths," he said, "but the bond was made long before the world even knew we were here." Losing Bobby meant losing the beginning itself, the laughter shared in cheap diners, the promises whispered in parked cars under street lamps, the belief that someday someone would finally listen. Now in his 80s, Eddie stands in rooms that once overflowed with voices and realizes how silent they've become. The group that once shook the earth with harmony now feels like a memory echoing down a long hallway. Only a few remain. Walter Williams Sr., his closest companion, the one man who has stood beside him through 6 decades of joy, loss, fame, and sorrow. Sammy Strain, who joined later and still carries the same spark of stage fire. Eric Nolan Grant, the younger voice who keeps the legacy breathing for a world that never knew their hungry beginnings. They laugh, they perform, they carry the banner, but between verses there is always that shared silence, the silence of those who should still be here. Sometimes during rehearsals, Eddie will glance toward the left side of the stage, where Bill once stood with folded arms and a quiet smile. Then his eyes drift to the right, where Bobby would tap his foot to the rhythm. And in the hum of the empty sound system, in the low drone of the lights, he hears something, soft harmonies rising like warm breath on cold air. "They never left," he whispered once. "Every time the crowd sings Love Train, I hear them, just singing from higher ground." When the audience leaves and the stage empties, Eddie lingers. His hand rests gently on the microphone stand, the same one he has carried through 60 years, 6 funerals, 6 lives intertwined with rhythm. The venue hums with the last ghost of applause. Somewhere in that fading echo, he hears laughter, guitar strings, voices blending in perfect thirds. The OJs were never just performers. They were blood not born but chosen. Most of that family now lives only in memory, their voices eternal in grooves of vinyl and the hearts of those who grew up singing along. Yet the dream still moves. The Love Train is slower now, quieter, but still running. And as long as Eddie Levert stands beneath the spotlight, eyes soft, microphone trembling in his hand, the music still lives. Because brotherhood does not end when the song fades, it simply shifts to another key. Now, at 83, Eddie stands as one of the last true kings of soul, a man who has survived joy so bright it blinded and sorrow so deep it could have swallowed him whole. He has buried sons, brothers, friends, yet every loss carved another truth into his voice. Pain is only love wearing a different face. Today he is not just the last voice of the OJs, he is its heartbeat. Quiet now, steady still. Eddie divides his days between Las Vegas and his hometown of Canton, Ohio. His Las Vegas home, a 3,700 square foot sanctuary beneath the desert sun, holds more memory than luxury. 4 warm rooms, 4 quiet hallways, a kitchen filled with light, a piano catching the morning sun where he still rehearses softly. The pool outside reflects the glow of the city at night, the grill still smokes on good evenings, and the small patch of grass is where he practices his swing as the day fades. The house is not decorated with trophies of fame, it is decorated with love. Photographs of Gerald, of Sean, of Ryan, of Martha, of William and Bobby and Bill and Frankie. On a shelf sits an old microphone from 1973, polished and waiting, still carrying the echo of Love Train. His net worth, about $20 million, is not the story. The story is the cost. Every dollar was earned with a song sung through hunger, heartbreak, and unbroken faith. 29 studio albums, 10 gold plaques, 10 chart-topping hits, and thousands of stages where the crowd rose to their feet. But the number that means the most is where he began, a barefoot child in Bessemer, Alabama, raised with more faith than food, carried north to Ohio with nothing but a voice and the courage to believe it mattered. From church choirs to backseat rehearsals, from split meals to sold-out arenas, Eddie Levert's life is the definition of climbing out of the impossible. He has always said, success isn't counted in what you have, it's counted in what you've survived. And though the trophies glitter and the records shine, some days the house feels too quiet, too wide, too echoing. His wife Raquel, the gentle, steady hand God sent when his world had already fractured, still sits beside him on the patio each morning. Together, they sip coffee and speak softly of their children, of Ryan's laughter, of the foundation they built in her honor so others might fight lupus with dignity and hope. The foundation's work keeps her alive in every family it helps. Over the years, Eddie has given hundreds of thousands to causes close to his spirit. The American Heart Association, lupus research, scholarships for young dreamers through the Levert Foundation. When you've been given time, he says, you learn to give back. And though he still performs now and then, the tours are lighter, the nights are slower, the applause more tender than thunderous. Walter Williams Sr. remains by his side, two kings, two brothers who weathered a lifetime of storms shoulder to shoulder. Sometimes Sammy Strang joins them, and when the harmonies rise, it feels like time itself holds its breath. They don't sing for fame anymore. They sing because it keeps them alive. Every night I step on stage, Eddie says, I sing for those who can't anymore. In the quiet hours, the loneliness settles, not sharp but heavy, like a memory that refuses to leave. He still hears their voices sometimes. Gerald's laughter down the hall, Ryan whispering Daddy, Sean humming from another room. These are not ghosts. These are blessings of love that refuses to fade. And though people whisper about whether he has other children, other joys, other heartbreaks left unspoken, Eddie holds some things sacred. Some love belongs to the soul alone, he says with a soft smile. What he does share freely is gratitude. Gratitude for music, for listeners, for breath, for survival. His days now are gentle, quiet morning walks, long phone calls with old friends, evenings spent in his studio shaping songs for a charity project he plans to release when he is gone. Not a farewell, just a thank you. Music gave me everything, he reflects. It gave me my family. It gave me my grief. It gave me God. In a world quick to forget its legends, Eddie Levert stands as proof that pain cannot silence a soul built to sing. From broken-down cars to platinum stages, from hunger to harmony, his story is one of endurance carved into melody. And so, when he steps beneath the lights now, microphone trembling gently in his hands, he closes his eyes and whispers the same prayer he has whispered for 60 years. Let me sing it right. Just once more, the lights lift, the music rises, and the love train rolls forward, slower now, wiser now, but unstoppable. Before you go, take a breath, press like, leave a heart, whisper a thank you into the quiet, for a man who turned sorrow into song, loss into legacy, and pain into purpose. May your life sing loudly, may your heart remain whole, and may you and the ones you love be safe, warm, and held through every storm. From our voice to your home, may you be blessed, always.